tools you can use to get more information about your possible relationship to the person you match. Ancestry said that Carol and I share 43 centimorgans and are probably 4th to 6th cousins. But for more information, I went to the Shared Centimorgan Project tool from Blaine Bettinger on DNA Painter. Bettinger has a PhD in biochemistry with an emphasis in genetics and is one of the original genetic genealogists. This chart shows the range for number of centimorgans shared for the various possible relationships, based on data collected over many years. You can see self in the white block in the middle. You can then check out the boxes for cousins, like first cousin, or 1C, to the right of self in a blue oval, showing 396 to 1,397 centimorgans. And further to the right, fourth cousin, 4C, showing 0 to 139 centimorgans, which includes the match for Carol and me at 43. Or, instead of hunting around the chart, I can enter the number of centimorgans I share with Carol in the data well at the top, 43, highlighted with a red oval, hit return, and up pop the possibilities. So this says Carol's and my most distant common ancestor, indicated by the first red arrow, would be an 8th great-grandparent. In other words, our connection is no further back than that. Our most likely relationship, the second red arrow, is some variation of 3rd to 7th cousins. And the 4th cousin relationship, which is the closest predicted by Ancestry and where Carol and I thought we might be related, has a 21% probability. So where are we related? Well, looking at my whole tree, it can be pretty daunting to figure it out. However, I can eliminate half the tree immediately, in part because Ancestry indicates that the match is on my father's side. But the reason Ancestry can make that prediction is that I had my mother's DNA tested before she passed in 2019, thanks to a fellow member of NSD's CGS pointing out that I should have my oldest living ancestor tested first. And since the match isn't on my mother's side, by default, it's on my father's side. From there, it's pretty easy to pick out Sarah Johnson in the upper right in the orange oval, my second great-grandmother, and the only Johnson on my paternal side. She's the most likely ancestor that connects me to Carol. Not to mention that that's who Carol said was our likely connection. So who is Sarah Johnson Barr, and what do I know about her? The answer goes back to the start of my obsession with family history, which starts around the time the picture on the upper right of my brother and me was taken. My family had moved to California when I was 5, and soon thereafter we began periodic trips to Clovis, California to visit Minnie and Wes, pictured in the lower left, brother and sister to each other, my grandfather's first cousins, and our only Barr relatives in California. Minnie frequently told family stories as we played Chinese checkers on a homemade board, not nearly as pretty as the one shown here. When I was in my early teens, it occurred to me that I should write down some of these ancestors. And since we raised Boston Terriers, hence the cute puppy picture in the lower right, it seemed natural to attempt my first family tree on a canine pedigree chart. At this point, Minnie was in her 80s, her mind was sharp, but her eyesight and hearing were failing. So it was challenging to follow what she said well enough to fill in the chart. But at some point she said, just write this down. So I turned over the pedigree chart and wrote down what she said, which turned out to be the names of her grandparents, my second great-grandparents, David Barr and Sarah Johnson, all 9 of their children, in birth order, with married names for the girls and spouses with maiden names for the boys, which I was able to verify later through various records. This family tree shows Minnie and Wes and their father, John W., the oldest brother of my great-grandfather George, the baby of the family. Minnie would frequently comment that my great-grandfather George, the youngest of David and Sarah's 9 children, seemed more like a brother than an uncle. And as I did more research, I realized why. By the time George was 10, both of his parents had died, and he and his next older sister, Kate, went to live with their oldest brother, John, Minnie's father. Since Minnie was just 2.5 at the time, and George was just 7.5 years older and living in the same household, he would indeed have seemed more like a brother than an uncle. In the local school records, I found John listed as George and Kate's guardian. Some of the first records I used to confirm Minnie's recollections were census records. Here are David and Sarah Barr and family in Pike County, Illinois in 1850 with their first child, Mary Elizabeth, and in 1860 with their first 5 children, still in Pike County. You remember Pike County is where Carol had noted that our family had come together. So who is Sarah Johnson Barr? She's my paternal second great-grandmother, and she and her husband David were the most distant ancestors on my first attempt at a family tree. Since then, I've been able to trace David's family farther back, but not Sarah's. So she is my longest standing brick wall. That brings me to Carol's Johnston family research. Her love of genealogy and research on the Johnston line began with diaries written by her grandparents. Sterling and Ida Johnston, her grandparents were Sterling and Ida Johnston, and the diaries were sent to her by her father when she was in her 20s. What a treasure. We'd all give our eye teeth to have journals like this. With her grandparents recording their thoughts and activities in words and pictures. One quote from her father, as recorded by her grandmother, is particularly relevant to today's case study. On June 26, 1914, when Bruce was 8 years old, Ida wrote, "Bruce doing fine on the fiddle. He's been bug hunting today and reading U.S. history. He said at supper, 'I don't care if this streak of the Johnston family does die out. I'm not going to get married.' Seems to realize that it all depends on him." Ida could not have more children, so Bruce was right. It all depended on him. Luckily, he changed his mind about marriage and children. The picture on the left is of Carol's father, Bruce, with his parents, Sterling and Ida, at about the time of this comment. And on the right is Carol and her brothers with their grandfather, Sterling, about 40 years later. In addition to the diaries, Carol's father gave her a copy of an Alaska Sportsman magazine from the 1950s, featuring brothers Jack and Bruce Johnstone, her grandfather's first cousins. So in 1970, she followed the clues she had and wrote an old-fashioned letter to the editor at the Ketchikan Daily News, telling about her grandfather's cousins who had lived in Ketchikan and asking for family contact information. 1 week later, she heard back from cousin Jenny in Alaska, who was about 5 years older. They corresponded for some time, but then lost contact for nearly 40 years. In 2010, Carol reconnected with Jenny through a local photographer who knew the Johnstone brothers, and the next year, on a cruise to Alaska, she was able to meet cousin Jenny in person and spend a day with her. They also visited a local museum to see an exhibit about the Johnstone brothers on the right, whose story helped bring them together. In 2009, Carol had connected with other Johnstone cousins, also from the Alaska branch, who lived north of Riverside. In 2010, she met cousin Pauline and her daughter Julie in Temecula, shown on the left. And in 2016, the Alaska and Southern California cousins met up in Alaska, as shown on the right. In 2014, Carol found another DNA cousin, Marilee, in Northern California, also descended from Stephen Johnston, Carol's second great-grandfather, but on a different branch than Jenny and the Southern California cousins. Carol and Marilee started working together to get Y-DNA testing, which is the male testing, of Carol's nephew and Marilee's uncle, plus doing extensive research in land records, census records, and DNA matches. The picture at the top right is from their first in-person meeting in 2018. The bottom picture is of Marilee, Carol, and Marilee's sister Judy, taken in a museum in San Clemente in front of a 1922 painting titled Sisters by Eduard Visicau. How appropriate, cousins and sisters and sisters. So although on different branches, all the cousins Carol had identified up to this point traced back to Carol's second great-grandfather, Stephen Johnson, her brick wall. So here's a timeline for Carol's Johnston-Cobby family. Like the other timelines I'll be showing, this doesn't list every record or event we found, but it lists enough to give you an idea of the whereabouts of each of the Johnsons or Johnstons or Johnstones that we traced. Stephen was born in Virginia and his wife Abigail in Ohio, which is where they were married in 1836. Their first son was born in Ohio, but they were in Pike County by 1841, Pike County, Illinois, when their second son was born. 8 more children were also born in Pike County, the last in 1861. The family moved to Kansas about 1865, spent a few years in Whitman County, Washington in the 1870s, and then returned to Kansas. I'm mentioning Whitman County because it comes up later. So going back to my second great-grandparents, this timeline shows why finding my Sarah was a light bulb moment for Carol when she realized how we were likely related just before writing to me in December 2019. Sarah and her family were in the same place, Pike County, Illinois, at the same time as Carol's Johnston line. Both David and Sarah were born in Ohio, David in Claremont County, which comes up later, but they were married in Pike County in 1847 and lived there until at least 1870.